Okay, so today's subject, we're really kind of continuing the history of Jerusalem, but in a way, it's important to understand that as while everyone's sort of yearning for Jerusalem, and Ramban will end his life in Israel, he really is a figure that belongs to an entirely different region. And so maybe the story of Jerusalem at this time is that scholarship is not at this moment centered in Jerusalem. Ramban is Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, and Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, he lives in the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century in Catalonia, which is the northeast corner of Spain. And he is really maybe he's the anchor of what's called the Catalonian school. And if you read the official title that we had for this, it was Parrying Christianity with one hand, holding on to Jerusalem with the other, or holding on to tradition with the other. Either one of those really fits. And the way I like to describe the Ramban is that he is the great utility infielder of Jewish letters. There's really no other figure who features prominently in every single category of rabbinic writing. Nachmanides wrote significantly on Talmud. He has a commentary on the Chumash. He has a book called Torah Adam, which is sort of a halacha book with also explanations, which is about the end of life. He writes on intimacy. He writes Jewish philosophy. He writes what are called books of defense. We'll get into those a little bit later. He also is probably the first mystic who writes somewhat proudly and openly about that subject. So really, you have Ramban in every single field. Maimonidian doesn't write a biblical commentary. Rashi doesn't do anything in philosophy. And so you really get Ramban in every single field. And so he plays all the positions, if you will. Okay. He is also unrivaled in terms of other medieval authorities. And I'm just starting you off with a couple of quotes from close contemporaries of the Ramban. The first one is his student and friend, Rabbi Shimon ben Aderet, the Rashba, who also lives, again, in this northwest corner of Catalonia. And he writes, I attest that our teacher, the great Rav Rabbeinu Moshe bar Nachman, of blessed memory, allowed and interpreted this. There was none that was greater than he in wisdom, age or number of students, and fear of sin. Meaning the Rashba, who himself was a tower, who is one of the pillars of halachic writing, tells us there was no one was his equal. And we'll get to what a child prodigy he was. But at the ripe age of 16, Ramban is already writing some of his literature. Another, the Rivash, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Sheshet, another great tower of this Catalonian school, writes that Ramban was Sinai, meaning he was the mountain himself. He had an immense knowledge of all Torah and sources, an uprooter of mountains. There's a Hebrew term called Oker Harim, which means that he could see tremendous insights, occasionally flip interpretations on their head. And all of his words were like coals of fire, inspiring and piercing. And all of Catalonia and its adjacent areas relied upon him as if he would be Moses himself quoting the Almighty. So these are strong approbations for the Ramban. He doesn't really need ours, but you should know that when we're talking about the Ramban, in many ways, he's more influential than Rambam in the classic world of learning. So who are Ramban's teachers? So he's very eclectic. And at this time, that's actually a very important thing. Just to show you a little bit here, a map is perhaps a little bit instructive. So, Rashi is going to be up here at, let me give a better color so we can see this. So Rashi's up here at Troyes, right? That's where Rashi is. Rashi's grandsons, for example, will occupy this area, Dompierre. the Rabbeinu Yitzchak of Dampierre is a great rabbi. The Maimonides is down here in southern Spain, and these two schools really don't know of each other. They act largely independently. The Tosafists didn't really have a copy of the Rambam, and then there's another school down here in this area called Provence, right? So if you've heard of Rabbi Avraham ben David, the
Languedoc.
Is that his technical name? Languedoc?
It's not. Provence is the other side of the river.
Okay. All right. In any event, this is another school of learning in southern France at that time. So here we're clearly, you see that these schools are separate. I wanted to show you that Ramban has teachers from all of those places. So his first teacher, Rabbi Meir Halevi Abulafia, the Ramah, he's Catalonian. Rabbi Yehuda ben Yakar is a student of the Ri. The Ri is Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre, right? So that Dampierre was that northern area that I showed you up here, right? So he has a teacher who is amongst the Tosafists. Then you also have Rabbi Natan ben Harav Meir, another one of the Tosafists, and he also has Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahor. Now, Yitzchak Sagi Nahor is another word for someone who is blind, and so his teacher is Rabbi Yitzchak the blind, and he is the son of the Ra'avad of Pasker. Maybe that's in Lamdok. Exactly which region that is, but that's on the other side of the Pyrenees from Spain.
It's now Vauvert.
Sorry?
At Posquier, it's now called Vauvert.
No, okay.
You had it on the map there.
Vauvert. Okay, right there. Yes. Yeah. Well, that's because when I had my Google Maps make my little road, I put in Pasquer, and it sent me right here. So it's an 11-hour drive from and then ends in Barcelona, which is where the Ramban is. The point that I'm making here is that the Ramban's education is very eclectic or broad, and it's including all of these other schools of learning. And one of the things that Ramban is very much about is defending the great ones. So history of sort of the scholarship at this point is the Talmud is produced, and then you have the Gaonic era. And really just after the Gaonic era, you have this very profound personality, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Alfasi. And what he does is he distills the Talmud. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi's writings are printed almost like they're a page of the Talmud. It is almost the Talmudic text, except he takes out extraneous material. And so he sort of redistills the Talmudic text, a little bit of his own opinion, but mostly trying to tell you, we rule like this opinion, that opinion. And so you could go through the Rif and get a very good idea of the distilled opinions of the Talmud. Now, you had rabbis who wrote various criticisms of the Rif. One was the Ra'avad, Rabbi Avram ben David of Pasker. Another one was the Baal HaMaor, Rabbeinu Zerachia Halevi. Zerachia means shining. And so he writes a commentary which is called the Baal HaMaor, the Master of Light. And both of these criticize the Rif for this decision or that decision. They are today printed below and around the Rif. And the Ramban, at the age of 16, writes 2 commentaries. And he does this to defend the position of the Rif. Almost everything that the Ramban will write is a way of defending some of the earlier traditions. So he writes this book, Milchemet Hashem, the war for God, that is written to defend the Rif against the criticisms of the Baal HaMaor, Rabbeinu Zerachia Halevi. The Sefer Zechut, which means the scroll, the book of defense, that is written to defend against the criticisms of the Ra'avad, Rabbi Abraham ben David. Okay, now, just to give you another example of this, Maimonides writes a famous book, which is actually, I have it here on my shelf, the Sefer HaMitzvot of the Ramban, right? This is the book of Rambam's list of mitzvot. The Rambam, though, deviated from an earlier Gaonic work, which cataloged the same. And the Ramban has, you can see it says underneath Hasagot HaRamban, with the criticisms or the glosses of the Ramban, the notes of the Ramban. What Ramban is doing here is he is trying to square the record and go back to the earlier Gaonic accounting. Everybody gets to 613. The question is, how do you enumerate, group together, categorize, etc.? So one of the most famous example of the difference is the Rambam. Maimonides does not list the mitzvah of living in Israel as a separate mitzvah. And the Ramban says, no, there is a separate mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. Another famous debate between them is the question of, is I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, is that going to be one of the 613 mitzvot? Or is that simply a premise upon which all of the other mitzvot need to be kept? And so, again, the Ramban here is defending earlier tradition. He's a true traditionalist in all senses of the word. Now, here, just a few of his writings. He says, I am who am merely the smallest of my tribe and most impoverished of my family. Was like this from the days of my youth. Today, as the stars of my old age shine upon my face, I still remain with my desire and passion to be a disciple of the early authorities and to reestablish and re-erect their words. Again, that's his mission, preserving tradition. He's not, as a personality, he's not one of these people who wants to change things. He feels that the giants of the earlier work, they were closer to Sinai, that there is this almost necessary process of decay, not necessary in the sense that we need to do it, but it's sort of baked into just like your paint chips and the color fades on, so too the Torah will become distorted over the process of time. And his goal is to hearken back to earlier generations who had a better glimpse of Sinai. Another interesting point is that even when he finds the positions problematic, he's still going to defend them. So the Shita Mikubetzet is a work which is a collection of teachings of various rabbis. We don't always have the exact same positions. Often we do, but it's collected. It was collected in the medieval period. And this is something attributed to the Ramban. He says, oops, sorry, I should learn how to use my own program here. He says, even though this position is not completely understandable, we place our heads under the soles of the feet of the early authorities. In other words, I don't understand why this rabbi wrote this, but I am going in this particular opinion in Kesuvot. He says, I'm going to accept it without fully understanding it. And so that this is very much who the Ramban is. I will say, though, that when you read the Ramban's commentary on the Bible, the Ramban's commentary on the Chumash, the Ramban is not afraid to disagree with Rashi. Ramban on a regular basis will disagree with Rashi because Ramban is also very faithful to a simple reading of the text. He's very faithful to trying to understand that. He also has a very deep sense of the psychology of the reading of the text of the Torah. So just as a very good example of the difference between Rashi and Ramban, Rashi will say that he will defend Abraham in leaving the land of Israel and going down to Egypt, and he will say that that Abraham was correct in the ruse that he did, where he told Sarah, "You should tell the Egyptians you're my sister." Ramban says that this is Abraham showing a lack of faith. God told you, go to Israel and trust me there. And Abraham should have trusted God. So Ramban does not shy away from criticizing when he sees that the faithful reading of the text is such. So especially in Chumash, the Ramban is a very clear reader, and he's going to say, look, our forefather Avram should have handled this test differently. Okay, now the Ramban, again at a young age, is going to enter into a very serious moment of trouble. And here it's as a community leader. And he's entering into the Maimonidian controversy. The Maimonidian controversy erupts from the following issue. The works of Maimonides are very well known and proliferate greatly throughout Spain because they are translated into Hebrew by Shmuel ibn Tibbon. And so if you've ever read, especially the Guide to the Perplexed, you will see that the Guide to Perplexed bears enormous consistency with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And it really is a very philosophical work. It has a lot to do with philosophy. If you recall to earlier installments of our Jewish history classes, we talked about the fact that in Baghdad, they were taking the great works of Greek philosophy and translating them into Arabic. And this is then transported into Arabic Spain, which is where Rambam gets his hands on it. And he reads Aristotle, and Aristotle is very influential in the works of Rambam in many places. And so Rambam is going to incorporate Aristotle. What happens is that this philosophy it's really a secondary phenomenon. There's nowhere where Rambam says, oh, because you study philosophy, you don't need to say the Shema. You won't find that in the works of the Rambam. But because Rambam became warm to philosophy, and there is this sense that Rambam is embracing secular parts of the world, it caused a sort of a secondary effect to the point where there were rabbis in France, specifically one whose name is Rabbi Moshe Mikutzi, who writes the Sefer Mitzvot Gedolot, the Sefer Mitzvot Ktanot, the small book of mitzvot, a compendium of mitzvot with explanations. He says that the problem in Spain is that people are starting to abandon putting mezuzot on their door, and they've stopped saying the Shema because they are so enthralled with the Rambam. This liberalism is scandalous to the rabbis of southern France, right, of Montpellier. And one of them, well, actually several of them, principally Rabbi Shlomo Minahar and his student, shouldn't say Reuben Yonah, it should be say Rabbeinu Yonah of Gurundi, who happens to be Ramban's cousin and close friend. The two of them issue criticism against Rambam. I should mention that there is a very fierce scholarly debate about who drew blood first. Now, what do I mean by drew blood? There's the most power. Anybody know what the most powerful weapon that any Jewish community had to coerce observance of mitzvot throughout the Middle Ages?
Cherem?
Cherem is the answer. Cherem means a ban. If you put someone into cherem, no one can do business with him. People can't talk to him. People can't visit him. It's an extremely powerful tool. And the way there's a debate who did the cherem first. But I think that the balance of opinion goes with the fact that Rabbi Shlomo Minahar put a cherem, put a ban on anybody who would study Rambam, the philosophical works of Rambam, which are two in particular. There are two works that are in question. One is the Rambam's Guide to the Perplexed, which was now translated by Shmuel ibn Tibbon, and the other is the Rambam's Sefer Hamada, the Book of Knowledge. This is the beginning of Rambam's magnum opus, the Code of Jewish Law, which is also called the Yad HaChazakah, the strong hand. And those two works were the ones that Rabbi Shlomo Minahar and Rabbeinu Yonah of Gurundi said, there's a ban on anybody who studies those. This is kind of like someone saying today, we're going to put in cherem anybody who studies Jonathan Sacks, right? Because in the yeshiva world, they don't learn Jonathan Sacks. he's good for shuls like Sharat Tzedek. But if there's some yeshiva out there were to say, okay, you know what, we're going to put a chayrim on anybody who studies Jonathan Sacks, because people who study Jonathan Sacks, they also read, Max Weber, and they read. Trying to think who else he likes to quote, Emil Durkheim. Well, and if you read Weber and Durkheim, before you know it, you're going to be reading Spinoza and Antinomian heresy. And so this idea that you put a Rambam in Cherem it's like they're poskening entire communities treif, because they do a lot of study of these books of the Rambam. So Rabbi David Kimchi of Provence, who's very closely tied to the communities of Spain, and many of the rabbis in Catalonia, Saragossa, for example, are going to say, you Rabbeinu Shlomo Minahar, you put those who study the Rambam in Cherem. Guess who's going into Cherem? We're putting a Cherem on you, and so you have competing charamim. The Rabbi Shlomo Minahar appeals to the rabbis of France, because the real Talmidei Chachamim, the undisputed champions of Torah at that time, were the rabbis of France. And Rabbi Shlomo Minahar appeals to the rabbis of France. He appeals to them to put Maimonides anyone who studies the works of Maimonides into cherem, into a form of excommunication. And and so what happens at this stage is Ramban tries to intervene. And he will ultimately write 2 letters. The first letter, he says, look, you know what? We shouldn't have this kind of controversy amongst the Jewish people. It's really could be a chilul Hashem. And so even though I'm younger and I'm less capable than other rabbis, because I understand the situation here, maybe both sides should come and sit in front of my Beit Din, and we'll resolve the issue, right? So guess what? Nobody wanted to go to the Ramban. And so the first letter fails. Then the Rambam writes a second letter to the rabbis of France, because he's really afraid that if the rabbis of France pronounce a ban, the rabbis of France are the greatest authorities of the day, and he might be compelled to listen to a ban from the rabbis of France. And so these are the words in his letter. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time that there's going to be so much verbiage in front of you, but I want to be able to give you a sense of really what's going on here. And so we're going to look at the writings of Ramban. And he writes, how can we expect to succeed in showing the full strength of our cause when we are facing the mighty ones, the foundations of the earth? We are not even fit to be called their companions in study. So basically, he's saying to the rabbis of France, you guys you're the great, great, great rabbis. I'm a little nobody. I'm a backwater. Turns out that in the end of the day, in the long sweep of history, Ramban is considered greater than any of them. But in his day, those were the great rabbis, and he is deferring to them. Therefore, today I appear only like a miner seeking enlightenment from his superiors. I shall thus remove the mask of shame from my face and examine the words of the French rabbis before me. But, O my masters, pray do not consider me an unknowing beast. Do not write for me what reason you have rendered your decision, in view of the fact that we have not been fortunate to hear it from you, being that the roads between us are not safe for travel and is therefore impossible to appear before you. We hope to obtain this knowledge by letter. I have seen the clear decision of your holy gathering, the rabbis and leaders of all France, declaring the ban upon every person who dares contemplate upon the words in the books of Moreh Nevuchim and Sefer Amada, your intention being that these books be hidden forever. So you rabbis of France, we have this rumor you've written that no one should ever study these books again. Okay, so we need to deal with it. He says, though, but why have you declared a ban upon all communities, considering them all of one category, thus failing to give honor to the great Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who built a fortress around the Talmud, a mighty fortress for the glory of God? It is he who has closed up the breach of the sanctuary and has restored it to his former glory. What the Ramban is telling them is, you guys are up there in France. In France, it's Lakewood. It's Mea Sharim. You don't need this stuff. And you shouldn't learn it up there in France. You're not troubled by the things that Ramban is, that by Maimonides is troubled by. But you know what? The situation down here in Spain is a whole different story. Do you know how people down in Spain earn a living? They work for the government. And in order to work for the government, you need to know city planning. You need to know math. You need to know philosophy. You need to know languages. You need to be able to speak, Arabic. You need to be able to speak Spanish. The Jews occupied these very important positions. The Jews, by and large, one of the things that they did was they were tax farmers. The most famous tax farmer of all, not, of course, a contemporary Ramban, but 200 years later will be Rabbi Dan Yitzchak Abravanel. But Jews were very much engaged in those professions. Jews had real educations in Spain. And so he says, you don't understand that the Ramban comes here to fill that gap. That's why I think Rabbi Sachs is a great example. If you're a real yeshiva bacher and you're learning Rashi and Tosfos and Shnai Mikra V'Echad Targum and you're totally immersed in your Torah, so maybe you don't need Rabbi Sachs. I would still argue personally that I think that he would give you a lot that you might not appreciate. But in terms of you preserving your Judaism, you don't need covenant and conversation, Rabbi Sachs's work, in order to do that. But if you're a university student, if you're studying at Stanford and you're being challenged by all sorts of things and saying, why do you need to marry Jewish? Isn't that racist? Then you need Jonathan Sachs. Jonathan Sachs steps into the breach and gives an educated university student something to be able to close his gap on. And that is what Ramban is saying. Ramban, and we'll see later on, Ramban is as frum as the next guy. He is a very, very devout individual. He himself, as we will see later, is no particular fan of studying philosophy, but he understands that Rambam has this tremendous place. And he will tell in his letter, he will mention the Yemenites even praise the Rambam in their Kaddish. That's how important the Rambam is to them. And so, he emphasizes to the rabbis of French, you just don't understand the context. You can't pronounce a ban over here because you don't know what you're going to do to my community. And he says he has helped and defended the entire exile, beginning with Spain and the other lands of the West, even to the eastern land of Israel. How much knowledge which lay scattered through the vast literature of the sages he has gathered. How much learning has he increased? How much food has he given to the hungry and counsel to the needy? You leaders of French community have been taught reliance upon tradition from infancy. You've always been planted firmly in the house of the Lord, but because of sorry, my text didn't transfer properly. You'll forgive me. Hold on. Want to make sure I get that right. But because of this, you will not recognize that it is he, namely Rambam, who has brought the dwellers back from afar. So we can see that, the Ramban tells us context. What then happens is the Ramban is partially successful. He manages to avert the ban between the books, but then things reach a really feverish pitch. In 1232, Rabbi Shlomo ben Avram Minahar does declare a prohibition on the Rambam. In the same month, in Av, they declare a cherem on Rabbi Shlomo Minahar. And then in 1233, the Inquisition is co-opted. Part of the issue back then is that the Catholic Church believed in faith alone without reason. That reason, logic was, if you will, treif. And it was something that the church itself was trying to ban. And so it's unclear exactly who. It may have involved Rabbi Shlomo Minahar, some of his disciples, or other people who caught wind of what he was saying. And they gave the Franciscan friars copies of the Rambam, and they said, look, this guy believes in reason, not faith. And if you've read Rambam, you know that he's a rationalist, she'en kamohu. He's a rationalist of uncommon proportions. And so in 1233, the Christians burn the Sefer Hamada and the Moreh Nevuchim, these two philosophically oriented works of the Rambam, in the streets of Montpellier. There are other reports that they went after the Rambam and then went for the Talmud. What everybody agrees to, there's no question about, is that in 1242, they burn the Talmud, the famous accusation of the burning of the Talmud that was done by a Jewish apostate named Nicholas Donin. He informs on the Talmud, and he writes a letter to the Pope, and he says that the Jews are no longer protecting the Old Testament. They have a new book that is more important to them than the Old Testament. And you know what the name of that book is? The Talmud. And in France, in Paris, they confiscate 24 cartloads of the Talmud. And in the middle of the summer, just after Parshat Chukat, they burn 24 cartloads of the Talmud in the streets of Paris. 24 cartloads of Talmud back then, of Talmud scrolls, is back then like burning the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Yeshiva University, and Ner Yisrael Rabbinical College. That's a lot of Talmud. That's a huge repository of Talmudic text. Goes up in flames. And Rabbeinu Yonah, the Ramban's cousin, who was a student of Rabbi Shlomo ben Avram Minahar, writes a book. He feels that his treatment of Rambam must have unwittingly caused this burning of the Talmud in Paris. And he goes as an itinerant preacher from city to city, and he writes a book about teshuvah, about repentance. It's called the Shari Tshuva, and has become a classic text of repentance. And it's a very it's a very telling story. I believe it's Franciscans, but maybe I have to double check. It may have been the Dominicans. Okay. So that is the unfortunate story, the unfortunate conclusion of this particular section. What I want to just show you is Ramban's aversion to philosophy as a pure discipline. Ramban did not have a problem with Maimonides teaching philosophy, but one of the suggestions that Ramban puts out in his letter is that according to Rambam's instructions, this philosophy should not be taught publicly. It's a book for people who are having challenges and want to read and understand and solve their problems. It is a guide for the perplexed, not a statement for everyone. And so Ramban, he gives us a little bit of a sense of his own philosophy and what that's all about. And so he will tell us, or rather his own relationship to philosophy. And he's going to tell us about the Exodus. And he says, accordingly, it follows that the great signs and wonders constitute faithful witness to the truth of the belief in the existence of the Creator and the truth of the whole Torah. He's going to say, what is the reason that God has this whole Egypt thing and this whole miracle thing and the 10 plagues and the splitting of the sea, all this stuff? It's to tell you that there's somebody who's got the keys to nature, that the designer, the creator, got it all under control. And it's meant to be a refutation of a certain philosophy. And because the Holy One, blessed He, will not make signs and wonders in every generation for the eyes of some wicked man or heretic, He therefore commanded us that we should always make a memorial or sign of that which we have seen with our eyes, and that we should transmit the matter to our children and their children, children's children, generations to come. Why does He do that? Because He says that some people denied the root of faith by saying that the world is eternal. Out of curiosity, who was it who said that the world was eternal? Anybody know? What philosopher said the world has always existed? Answer is Aristotle. If the story goes that Einstein missed the concept of the Big Bang because he put a coefficient in his equation to account for, I believe, what was the apparent expansion of the universe, because the universe can't be expanding because it's always existed. And Einstein considered that one of his great mistakes, because he was so convinced by Aristotle that Aristotle was right, that the universe was eternal. So he had to put in some coefficient to explain something that didn't work in his theory. Here, Ramban is saying, don't get too excited by this Aristotle guy. Some people, meaning Aristotle, denied the root of faith by saying that the world is eternal. They denied the eternal, capital E, meaning God, and said it is not he, God, who called for the world into existence. Others denied his knowledge of individual matters. And he goes through a litany of philosophical beliefs which need to be dispelled by the story of the Exodus. And so for Ramban, the whole idea of Pesach, we love to talk about Pesach as sort of this freedom holiday, like it's Martin Luther King Jr. and Thomas Jefferson and that whole bit. For Ramban, that's not what the holiday of Pesach is. Holiday of Pesach is dummy. Pharaoh's not in charge. God's in charge. There's a creator here. There's a creator who is invested in every moment of creation and is controlling it and is operating miracles and guiding the Jewish people. That's what you're meant to see on Pesach. Yeah, God skipped over your ancestors' house, says Ramban, because God wanted you to be here today to understand God. That's Ramban's version of Pesach. It is a holiday of revelation, of recognition of God. That's what it's all about. So he's very much not seduced by this philosophical piece. He is, again, we will see, we're not going to have time this week. I think we'll have a little bit, I'm going to have to dedicate at least 2 weeks to Ramban. My hope is our next installment is going to be Ramban's mysticism and Ramban's disputation at Barcelona. Both very, very important events in Ramban's life. But this just shows you that he is a deeply spiritual person, in the sense that he does not run to philosophy. He runs to spirituality. Now, this is an interesting scholarly debate. There's a letter that of Rav Hai Gaon that is cited by Maimonidian in one of his letters. And there are two different versions of this. And different scholars look at this differently. But we'll see what it says. It says, you will find fear of sin, humility, and sanctity only among those who engage themselves in the combined study of the Mishnah, Talmud, and wisdom, but not in the words of wisdom alone. So, meaning, if you want to develop your own personal fear of sin, you want to be God-fearing person, and you want to develop humility, and you want to develop sanctity. So what do you have to do? You have to engage in the study of Mishnah, good, Talmud, good, wisdom, but not in the words of wisdom alone. So meaning, if you're going to study philosophy, it's going to have to be in sort of the Rambam form. Or if you're going to study philosophy, it's going to have to be mixed in with Jewish things. This is the text as it appears for Rabbi Dr. Charles B. Chevelle, who is a great scholar of Ramban, who was the one who produced the translation of Ramban and the critical editions of Ramban, and who wrote a book on Ramban, which I have, which my son dutifully got me out of the UBC library, which is called Ramban, His Life and Teachings. You can see here, Ramban, His Life and Teachings. This is his text. Another great Jewish historian, Rabbi Dr. David Berger, says, you got to get rid of that word, right? And here, wisdom is chokhmah, but he says not in the words of chokhmah. In other words, don't go studying philosophy. That's not what you're meant to do. And so it seems that according to David Berger's version, which is consistent with what we saw in the Ramban's commentary on Exodus, that you don't want to study philosophy. Okay. Okay, I'm running a little bit late, so I'm going to skip to the last piece, which is the Ramban on his trip to Israel. So the Ramban goes to, okay. The Ramban goes on a trip to Israel. And in his at the end of his trip to Israel, he writes a letter to his sons. And he says, "The Lord bless you, my son Nachman, and see you the good of Jerusalem, and see your children's children. May your table be as the table of our father Abraham. In Jerusalem, the holy city, I write to you this letter. For thanks and praise to the rock of my salvation, I was deemed worthy and arrived safely on the 9th day of the month of Elul, and I stayed there safely until the following Yom Kippur. At this time, my intention is to go to Hebron, the city of the graves of our ancestors, and to prostrate myself over them in prayer, and hew for myself there a grave with the help of God. And what shall I tell you with regard to the land? Many are its forsaken places. The great wastes, the heart of the matter is, the more sacred the place, the greater the devastation it is suffered at the hands of the, I believe it says, the hands of the Tartans is the next word, which somehow got chopped off. And he writes, Jerusalem is more desolate than all the country, Judea more than Galilee. Meaning the more Jewish the place, the worse condition it is in. And this is consistent with what we've seen before. We've seen that Jerusalem is really forsaken at this time, whether it was the Christians in the Crusades, now it's under Saladin or post-Saladin. The Muslims are not really letting the Jews into Jerusalem. Yet in all its destruction, it is an exceedingly good land. It has about 2,000 inhabitants, about 300 Christians who escaped the sword of the Sultan, and no Jews in it. For since the arrival of the Tartars, they are from there, and they were killed by them. There are only two brothers, dyers by trade, who buy their dyes from the ruling power. It is in their house that the minyan gathers for the prayers on Shabbat. So we find that they're two Jews, and somehow they have permission to live there, and there are, there's a minyan that comes into Jerusalem proper for Shabbos. And now I've urged them and found a vacant house built with marble columns and a beautiful cupola, which it took for a synagogue, as the city is now ownerless, and whoever desires to take possession of the ruins may do so. In a minute, I will share a screen of the Ramban synagogue in Jerusalem, which has been restored. But the Ramban he builds this synagogue in Jerusalem. He says, we then gave our offers for the repairs of the house, and now they have already sent to the city of Shechem to bring back the scrolls of the law formerly of Jerusalem. So that means that there were Torah scrolls that got sent up north to the city of Shechem to protect them, because we couldn't keep them in Jerusalem, which has been taken there at the invasion of the Tartars. Thus they will establish a synagogue where they will pray, for people, men and women, are constantly coming to Jerusalem from Damascus, from Tsova, which is Aleppo, all districts of the country over it, to see the sanctuary and to mourn. Now he who has deemed us worthy to see Jerusalem in her destruction, may he deem us worthy to see her in her restoration and recovery, when the glory of the divine will return to her. And you, my son, and your brother, and the whole of the family, may you all live to see the good Jerusalem and the consolation of Zion. Your concerning and forgetting father, who is seeing and rejoicing, Moshe, the son of Rabbi Nachman, of blessed memory. So this is Ramban's his final letter to his children, and where he describes us what he did at the end of his life, is that he comes to Jerusalem and he's going to rebuild this synagogue. This letter is written by the Ramban. And here I'll just show you give me 1 second to show you a picture of the Ramban synagogue as it is today in Israel. This is right in the heart of the Jewish quarter of Israel, and you can see it. It was once called the Chorva, the destroyed synagogue. Ramban rebuilt it, and Ramban is a passionate Zionist. He is one who believes that the land of Israel has a special spirituality. It has a special responsibility. That here, actually, let me go back to my slideshow. I have one more slide to show you there. This is from his commentary on the book of Vayikra, Leviticus. He says, but the land of Israel, which is in the middle of the inhabited earth, is the inheritance of the Eternal, designated to his name. He has placed none of the angels as chief observer or ruler over it, since he gave it as a heritage to his people, who declare the unity of his name and his seed of his beloved ones. It is with reference to this that he said, and ye shall be mine own treasure from among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And it is further written, so shall ye be my people, and I will be your God, and you will not be subject to other powers at all. Now he also sanctified the people who dwell in his land with the sanctity, observing the laws against forbidden sexual relationships, and with abundant commandments, so that they would be dedicated to his name. Meaning, God has a godly living that is designated for his land. Babylonia's got its angels. Egypt's got its angels, right? When Jacob goes out of Israel, the angels have to exchange on the ladder because there's no angels in Israel. It is for this reason, and ye shall keep my statutes, all my ordinances, and do them, that the land whither I bring you, dwell therein, vomit you not out. Meaning, if you don't do the mitzvot in the land, it said the verse in Vayikra says, "Vataki haaretz et yoshveha," and the land will spit you out. It will vomit you out. And it's a violent image, and Ramban embraces that image. He says, because you have to live a Jewish life consistent with the land of Israel. This is a spiritual pact covenant. It is like eating, it is eating like a food that your body wants to reject, should you not keep mitzvot in Israel. And he continues, but I have said unto you, you shall inherit the land, and I will give it unto you to possess it. I am the Lord your God, who have set you apart from the other peoples, meaning to say that he has set us apart from the nations over whom he appointed princes and other celestial powers by giving us the land of Israel, so that he, blessed be he, will be our God, and we will be dedicated to his name. Thus the land, which is the inheritance of the glorious name, will vomit you out all those who defile it, and will not tolerate worshippers of idols or those who practice immorality. Ramban, incidentally, writes his commentary on the Chumash after the Great Disputation. And I believe the way it works is Ramban wins the disputation and is then kicked out of Spain. He goes up to Provence for a short period of time and then figures out a way to get to the land of Israel. And so, seething from the wounds of this disputation, which we will talk about, the Ramban is saying, in the midst of feeling the lances of Christianity poking at his back, knowing that the Christians and the Muslims have wrestled over this land of Israel, understanding the spirit of Europe at this time, that the kings of Spain see themselves as on their own crusade to reconquer Spain from the Muslims, just like their French cousins, were trying to take the land of Israel from their Muslim infidels. He knows that there's this great world struggle between these powers, the Christian and Muslim powers. And he's saying there's one truth in all of this. There's a piercing, everlasting, cosmic truth. It is a mystical concept that to be able to see a higher order truth above the noise of the world. And Ramban keys into that directly. That's why he goes to Israel. Because he says in Israel, the Jew has to live by God's rules. There is a more eternal law than that of the Christian or the Muslim. And it is by that I'm intending to live. And he believes, and he writes in many places, that it's our obligation to live in Israel. Ramban will become the great champion of the religious Zionist movement, because the Ramban is the one who says you have to live in Israel. That a Jew out of Israel is a fish out of water, and a Jew out of mitzvot is a fish out of water, out of water. It's even worse than that. He sees you have to be a Jew observing mitzvot in the land of Israel. That is the only way to be, and that's exactly what you get from this piece of Ramban's commentary. This is Ramban, and so I will anyway. Let's. I think I'll at this point we can talk. Take any questions. I'll stop the recording.